Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning for those on the West Coast, and good evening for those in Europe. I'm Adam Froman, and welcome to the Center of eDemocracy's first webinar presentation. Not only am I CEO of Delvinia, but I'm also the founder and chair of the center. And before we kick off the webinar, I wanted to just give a little bit of background about the center and let everyone know what we're trying to achieve. Over the past few years, I've been partnering a great deal with universities in helping them initiate research in various areas of how digital technologies are affecting society. And realizing that there was a lot of knowledge being created in the universities, but it was companies like mine that were initiating this research that can translate and disseminate it. I thought that establishing a center to help accelerate the initiation, translation, and dissemination of academic knowledge would really help society. And particularly, the area that I wanted to consider was around democracy and technology. And the important thing what we wanted to achieve is to make this knowledge freely available and easy to understand. So with the growth of digital technologies in every aspect of our lives, my goal is to make the center a hub for eDemocracy research. As the center grows, it will house comprehensive repository of freely available academic reports on a range of topics like internet voting, open government, and intelligent communities, all written in plain, clear language that's really easy to understand. By initiating, translating, and disseminating research and knowledge on the impact of digital technologies on democracy, of studies such as Nicole's Internet Voting Project, we're looking to inform citizens and governments and make a real impact on Canadians' knowledge and understanding of the use of technology in society and politics. The other major goal I had was to make the center self-sustaining. The center is a charitable organization, and to make it happen, we're raising money to develop a research hub to facilitate this knowledge translation and make it available to the general public. So if you're interested in helping us achieve our vision, please visit our center website and make a donation. I want to now thank some of our sponsors for this webinar. My company, Delvinia, has helped to bring the webinar together and to do a great deal of work behind the scenes, and I want to thank my staff for putting so much time into this. I want to thank the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and the AMCTO for particularly really helping to promote this webinar and make awareness of this research available. And I'd like to thank IntelliVote for helping sponsor financially to help put this webinar on. So before I turn things over to our featured speaker, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to take care of. First of all, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the center's website next week. For questions and answers, please submit your questions through the Q&A tab on the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Be sure to sign up to the CED newsletter to receive any updates in future webinars and presentations that we're going to be putting on. And finally, I want to apologize. This presentation is in English only, and we'll only be fielding questions that are in English, but for the future, we're going to be working on having a fully bilingual webinar. So now to our featured speaker. I'd like to introduce you to Nicole Goodman. Many of you may know her already as someone who's been quite a bright light in the area of academic research in alternative voting methods and the modernization of elections. Nicole is currently the research director for our Center for eDemocracy, and she's also an assistant professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on political participation in Canadian and comparative contexts. So she's really looking at the electorate's perspective on their attitudes to elections and the impact of technology on how they want to participate in democracy. Many of her current projects address how digital technologies are transforming opportunities for citizen engagement, and internet voting is one of her subject specialties. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Nicole Goodman.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'd like to just begin by thanking the Center for facilitating this webinar and making it happen. I'm so happy to be able to really disseminate this research to a large group of people who are interested in the findings. So the title of today's presentation is the 2014 Ontario Municipal Elections and Electoral Modernization. Excuse me. So electoral modernization is currently a trend that's occurring worldwide. It doesn't always have to be the incorporation of digital technology in the election process, but that is what it's often associated with currently. So the major trend that I'm going to be discussing today, and then more specifically about internet voting, is governments including digital technology into their election processes in hopes of modernizing their elections. And we're seeing this happen in all sorts of ways. So poll worker training is one example, compilation of voters lists, the casting of ballots, and the counting of ballots. So at various phases of the election process, we're also seeing it happen in between those phases that I listed, such as verification, for example. It's important to understand that internet voting is only one part of this modernization. So just including internet voting doesn't modernize an election, but it's one component of many trends that are being implemented to modernize elections. Okay, so rationale for modernization. So why are jurisdictions going ahead and modernizing elections? The rationales vary tremendously, but basically these are some common rationales. We're hearing government officials say that they're introducing digital technology to improve trust in elections, to help with fraud mitigation, to introduce additional efficiencies such as reducing costs or making the tabulation more efficient at the end of an election or election wrap-up, improving accessibility, improving turnout. But really the common denominator that we see among all jurisdictions is this urge or want to optimize or innovate. It depends on the area. In Latin America, it's referred to as the optimization factor. In Europe, they refer to it more as innovation. In Canada, it's seen as leadership in e-government. And there are different motivations for this. In the case of Canada, often it's leadership of e-government. In the case of Latin America, it's improving trust in elections. But this need to sort of be an innovator is a common trend that helps account for why jurisdictions are including digital technology in the election process. So what are some current trends in the modernization landscape? Well, there's 4 trends that I wanted to pick out and sort of highlight for you. The biggest trend right now actually has to do with e-voting machines. So we're seeing this happen quite a lot in Europe, in Latin America, and in Australia. And predominantly this is being used for the counting of ballots and not the casting of ballots, which is interesting. Internet voting actually has been put on the back burner largely around the world with respect to the development that was going on in the early 2000s. There are, of course, exceptions to this, Canada being one, Switzerland, Estonia, and in one area of Australia, New South Wales. But generally, internet voting developments are not moving as quickly as they once were. Another trend is gradual development. So the late 90s, early 2000s, when a lot of jurisdictions started implementing internet voting and other digital technologies, many of them were just jumping in headfirst and trying to implement as much as they could. The UK is a classic example of this in their municipal elections. And these large projects were not going well because they were just jumping into things too quickly. So now when we see jurisdictions, governments, EMBs implementing this technology, we're seeing very gradual development. This can be with many pilots over time, or it can be through the introduction of one model and then slow expansion of it. And then finally, standards. standards is a big trend going on right now. This can either be the development of new standards or the revisitation or refinement of existing standards. We're seeing this in a couple of different ways. One is certification. So some jurisdictions want to show that they have a clear election management process in place. And so they're pursuing ISO certification, for example. In other areas, it's specifically focused on regulation. These could be legal, operational, or technical in nature. And these surround usually the operations of the election process. A really good example of this right now is the Council of Europe recommendations from 2004 and how they're being revisited and revamped. Okay, so why has e-voting euphoria subsided, or specifically more internet voting? I use the terms e-voting and I-voting a lot, and I'll just make a clarification. So I-voting refers to internet voting, which means casting a ballot on an electronic device that's enabled with an internet connection. E-voting, by contrast, is using some type of technical or digital device to be able to vote, but not necessarily over the internet. So it's been established pretty clearly that internet voting is not the magic bullet solution that's going to fix our electoral ills. Late 90s, early 2000s, especially in Europe, there was this perception that the introduction of technology in the election process could solve our institutional problems, could solve cultural problems with the electorate, and could even improve our democracy. And the real answer is that these simple structural changes, while they can deliver benefits, they're not going to solve all the ills of our electoral processes. So largely, the e-voting hype which emerged in Europe is over. And there's some other factors that contribute to this, such as budget crises, growing distrust in the internet, and shifts in political attitudes. In other regions, such as Latin America, e-voting is more about legitimacy and trust and less about participation. It's not that these countries, such as Brazil, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Mexico, Panama, and Costa Rica, it's not that they don't care about participation. It's just that in those areas, they're more concerned with fostering public trust in elections. And so they're more focused on implementing technology for the counting of ballots as opposed to the casting of ballots. So where does Canada fit into all this? Well, Canada currently has the greatest use of remote internet voting, so being able to cast a ballot by internet remotely from your home or workplace, vehicle, internet cafe, in binding local elections than anywhere else in the world. We're seeing all kinds of use of technology in Canada. It's being used for poll worker training, voter list amendments, the casting and counting of ballots, and various other phases. However, Canada is lagging behind right now if we look at the worldwide picture in three areas. And the first of these has to do with process and procedures and evaluation. So because we're seeing internet voting be implemented at the local level, there isn't maybe the robust evaluation programs that there are in other areas. Now, part of this is political. In Canada, historically, municipalities did not have much autonomy over policy. It was written by the provinces, evaluated by the provinces, and simply implemented by the municipalities. However, in the early to mid-90s, this started to change, and since then, municipalities have been gaining a lot more autonomy and control. So we're starting to see evaluation programs develop, but they're not consistent across the board. The next area that Canada lags behind has to do with regulations. So a lot of other jurisdictions that are implementing digital technology have regulations or minimum standards that sort of provide a framework for the introduction of this technology. And we don't have that in Canada. We're one of the only areas that doesn't. And then finally, technology. So I mentioned before how internet voting isn't necessarily, proliferating like it once was, but there is still good growth in Switzerland, Estonia, there's developments in Australia, and then of course in Canada. These other countries, Australia, Estonia, and Switzerland, are really embracing this trend of verification, whereas we aren't in Canada. So I'll just quickly explain what I mean by verification. There's three ways to sort of verify the vote. And the first is my vote cast as intended? So this is the equivalent of marking the ballot correctly. So it would allow the voter to ensure that their vote had been cast as intended. The second way is the vote included as cast? So this is the equivalent of putting the ballot in the box and ensuring that, your vote was included as you cast it. And then the third way is to ensure that the vote was correctly tabulated and reported. So that means having an accurate count, which is very important. Sorry. Okay, so still we can learn a lot from Canada. Despite the fact that it's lagging behind, there's a lot of activity going on here, and it's a really important area that we can learn from and study from. So some of the reasons for this is the nature of Canada's federal state presents many laboratories for testing and trials. So Ontario is a great example. There's 414 municipalities in the province of Ontario that are in charge of the planning and execution of elections. It's a lot of testing ground. Another really cool feature is that the autonomous nature of municipal elections means that there are many more models and approaches. So pretty much the only thing that municipalities need from the province is the supportive legislative framework to be able to proceed. Provinces write the Municipal Elections Acts, which govern elections for municipalities. But as long as the provincially written Municipal Elections Act has a stipulation that allows for the use of alternative voting methods or electronic voting methods, however it's worded, then municipalities are free at their own discretion to proceed with using digital technology such as internet voting in any way that they wish. So this is great. It's allowed for a patchwork of development, which means we see many different models all across the province and also in Nova Scotia, which is the other province where municipalities are currently using internet voting in binding elections. This isn't great for consistency, but it's very, very important for learning. So, knowing this, the Internet Voting Project came about. And the main crux of the Internet Voting Project is to understand the impacts of internet voting on elections. So we know that all of this exciting development is occurring in Canada, and there's little research examining it. Prior to the Internet Voting Project, Delvinia carried out surveys in the town, well now the city of Markham, formerly the town of Markham, in 2003, 2006, and 2010. And they surveyed voters, and then in 2010 they also surveyed candidates. So this is really an expansion of that study, adding additional stakeholder groups and expanding the group of municipal participants to get a wider range of participants and really understand what are the impacts across the province. The municipality of Markham, for example, may be unique with respect to certain areas. So if we take a larger sample, what are some differences that we observe? This was funded by an Insight Development Grant through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and through generous support and participation from partners. So academically, the University of Toronto and McMaster have helped sponsor it. In terms of industry partners, Asking Canadians gave a very generous contribution to be able to fund the survey portion of the project. Environics Analytics generously donated information, and of course this would not have been possible without the cooperation of the internet voting vendors. And finally, again, it would not have happened without, of course, the participation from 47 municipal communities across Ontario, so very thankful for that. Two reports are going to come from this. The main report is going to be a plain language report. It's going to be published by the Centre on the Centre website, freely available to all of you in PDF format. And there is a larger report that's going to go, a more academic report, to municipalities. It's one of the deliverables for their participation in the project. And after it is sent to municipalities, it will be published on the project website. Okay, so this portion of the Internet Voting Project looked at the 2014 Ontario municipal elections and surveyed voters, internet and paper ballot voters, candidates, election administration, so all a range of stakeholders. All 97 municipalities were approached to participate in the research, and 47 elected to do so. And we have a really great mix of small, medium, and large municipalities, urban, suburban, rural in terms of density, with very socio-demographic profiles, and some municipalities with large seasonal populations, which is really important as well. So this is just a map to graphically show you which municipalities used internet voting, which didn't, and which municipalities participated in the study. Okay, so if you see a municipality in purple, that means they did not use internet voting. If they are highlighted in orange or green, it means they did. and the green shading means that they were a participant in the project. So you can see from looking at the map that we have pretty good representation across the province. There are some, clusters of municipalities, but it's not overwhelming, and they are fairly well scattered. So we have a good regional representation. In terms of electorate size, this chart demonstrates that for you, and you can see that there's a lot of smaller municipalities. And quite often when I'm discussing the results with people, they'll say, oh, you had a lot of smaller municipalities participate. Is this a concern? Well, it could be one of two things. One, it could be that smaller municipalities were more attracted to the study. Two, it could be that smaller municipalities are attracted to internet voting, and so they were willing to participate in the study. But the reality is that 70% of Ontario municipalities are comprised of 10,000 electors or less. So the nature of Ontario's municipal composition is smaller, so this is completely consistent with that, and it's great. So we're quite happy with the sample. So I-voting approaches. I'm going to quickly go over this for you because I think it's really important to have context as we're going through the internet voting results. So there are three different dimensions that I've highlighted that can vary the approach that a municipality uses. So when we're talking about voters' attitudes towards internet voting or election admin attitudes or candidate attitudes, not every single one of these municipalities adopted the same approach to internet voting. They didn't implement it the same way. So one of the main differences has to do with the online voting period. So some municipalities made internet voting available only in the advanced portion of the election. And these dates can vary. It could be for 2 days, 5 days, 21 days in some municipalities. Or internet voting can be made available for the full election. So this includes the advanced voting period, and it includes election day as well. The second dimension, which can differ, is the voting process. And we typically see this in two ways. One is a one-step method of voting, whereby voters are able to go online and cast a ballot, just with PIN or PIN of date of birth. There's no registration required. They can just go online and do that. And you'll see that there's percentages put in there, 59, 29, and 12. Those percentages are the percentage of the 97 municipalities that used internet voting in 2014 and the approach that they went with. So 59% went with one approach, 29 with one, and 12 with the other. The second approach is a two-step voting approach. And this requires registration first. So if you want to be able to vote online, you have to go on, register, and then you get some additional information, and you can go online and cast your ballot. Generally, the one-step method of voting was more popular. We typically see the two-step method of voting be adopted by larger municipalities, typically those over 25,000 electors. And then the last dimension that can differ with respect to voting approaches is the ballot types that are offered. So we see some municipalities, such as Leamington, for example, that offer an internet-only election. Other municipalities, such as Ajax, offer an e-only election, so remote and at the poll. And then we see a municipality such as Markham that offers internet voting and paper ballot voting. So, there's a range of ballot types that can be offered, and this also changes the approaches and should be brought into context when we're considering the results. Okay, so survey data. So I'm only going to go over today the Internet Voter Survey, Candidate Survey, and Election Admin Survey. I'm not going to go over the paper survey. I'll to highlight a couple of things, but the rationale for doing this is that we only had, because of resource constraints, we only had 4 municipalities participate in the paper study, and so it's not quite as representative as these surveys, and also it doesn't speak to the impact of internet voting on elections per se, as well as these do. So this is going to be the focus of the presentation today. So the Internet Voter Survey was a survey of internet voters. It was conducted as an exit poll survey once electors had cast their ballot online. There were 43 municipalities that signed up to participate in this component of the project, and we received just over 33,000 responses during the peak time period from October 2nd to October 27th, which is great. There was just over 196,000 online ballots cast by those municipalities, which gives us a response rate of 17%, so we were really happy with that. The Candidate Survey and Election Administration Survey, 47 municipalities participated in each of those. Those surveys ran from November 7th to 21st, and we had pretty good samples. 299 candidates completed the survey, and 164 election administrators. So, the results. These are not all of the results, but I'm going to talk about some high-level results that I think are interesting. So first, we're going to start with satisfaction for every stakeholder group. So overall, Internet voters say that they're satisfied. They're strongly satisfied with Internet voting. 95% report being satisfied. And they describe casting a ballot online as easy, simple, straightforward, private, and convenient. 95% also say that they would recommend it to others. When we ask them about using it in future elections, we can tell that they're really satisfied. So 98% of the group say that they would be willing to use it in a future municipal election, 95% in a provincial election, and 94% in a federal election. So they don't really distinguish much between the elections and seem to want to see this service offered in all elections. And finally, it's electors' preferred voting method. Now, this wasn't asked as a question in the survey, but when we look at the number of ballots cast, the ways that voters voted in these elections, in 86% of the 97 communities that used Internet voting was the preferred voting method over all other ballot types. 93% of those communities in the study favored Internet voting. So what does an average Internet voter look like? I always love this question. When I'm talking to students, I like to try and paint a picture for them of, if you were walking down the street, how would you know an Internet voter if you saw one? So you can see that these characteristics have been grouped along 3 dimensions: socio-demographic profiles, attitudinal profiles, and profiles of digital literacy. So the average age of an Internet voter in this study is 53 years old. The most popular age group was between 55 and 64. They have an annual household income of $80,000 or more before taxes, which the Ontario average currently, according to StatsCan, is $76,000, so it's just above that. In terms of marital status, they are married. Community density, they come from an area that's suburban or urban. And education, they have some university or above. So they are fairly well educated. In terms of attitudes, voting history, they report being habitual voters. So this means that when you ask them about past elections in which they were eligible to vote, they report saying that they voted in all elections or in most elections. So these people are engaged voters. They're not apathetic voters. Then when we ask them about their interest level in politics, they report that they're moderate to highly interested in politics. Now, we can tell from other voting behavior studies that when people say they're not interested in politics, they're much less likely to vote. So this is consistent with their voting history, and it also indicates to us that these people are engaged voters. And then finally, the main reasons for use. So convenience is the primary reason for use that's offered among these voters, which is consistent with being a habitual voter. Typically, someone who was apathetic, we might see them giving different reasons, but this is consistent with that profile. And then in terms of digital literacy, and this may be no surprise to many of you, they report having fast at-home internet connections. They report using the internet every day. And when you ask them about their knowledge of computers and the internet, they report being fairly to very confident in their knowledge of the technology. So these are some interesting findings that I pulled out. So these may not necessarily be aggregate findings, but these are some interesting findings. So when comparing paper ballot voting to internet voting, we can see that internet voting really appealed to rural voters. So you'll notice in the previous slide, I showed the chart that said that the average internet voter lives in an urban or suburban area. And this is true based on the average. So without showing you a graph, about 40% of internet voters came from the suburbs, about 30% came from urban areas, and about 29% came from rural areas. Then if we compare that to paper ballot voters, we can see that a majority of paper ballot voters, 57%, came from urban areas, and only 10% of those were rural voters. So there seems to be much more favoritism among urban voters for paper ballot voting, and much more favoritism among rural voters for internet voting. There are many reasons for this. I mean, if you live in an urban center, presumably there's more voting locations, they're more convenient, closer together, there's better transportation systems. But it's interesting that rural voters seem to be more attracted to internet voting. Could be for reasons of accessibility. The second main finding is that you don't have to use the internet every single day. Some of you may say, well, this totally contradicts what you just said about the average Internet voter profile. Yes, that is the profile of the average Internet voter, but when we look at these older people a little bit more closely and segregate by age, we can see that a lot of them don't have very robust Internet voting profiles. They use the Internet and they have it, but they don't always use it every day. So a lot of the older electors that made use of Internet voting maybe didn't use it every day, and they were okay with using it. And then finally, and this is important, there's a modest potential to engage non-voters. So it's not a panacea for turnout decline. It's not going to solve turnout decline or improve it, but there's modest potential to see improvements. So 14% of the sample said that they definitely or probably would not have voted otherwise if it hadn't been for Internet voting. And if we look at their voting histories and the reasons they gave for not voting in past elections, we can see that a majority, 58%, gave rationales that said that they didn't vote because of what we can call everyday life issues. So the main reasons were that they were too busy, that the voting locations were inconvenient, that they were out of the municipality, country, province, whatever, illness, and mobility issues. Those were sort of the main reasons. So Internet voting can help with complaints about accessibility as reasons for not voting, but it's not going to be a fix for people who do not like the candidates, for people who are apathetic, for people who are not interested. It's not going to bring them into the voting process. So the candidate survey. Again, for satisfaction, candidates report being very satisfied, 69%. When asked about the security of the election, 74% were satisfied, and the posting of election results, 64% were satisfied. A strong majority of candidates, 89%, favor as having Internet voting as an additional method in elections. So they were very favorable for this. However, when we asked them, do you support Internet voting being the only voting method, they were against that. So 64%, again, a majority, does not want to see Internet voting as the only voting method in elections. So perceived impact on campaigns. I found this to be one of the most interesting findings from the candidate survey. 64% of candidates, so a majority, felt that it had an impact on the campaign. And they sort of articulated 5 ways in which they observed this. The first was making the beginning of the campaign more crucial, and we've seen this before in the research from Markham as well. We find that when candidates are canvassing and going door to door, they are encountering many more people who have voted. So 91%, for example, of candidates said that they encountered more than half of the people who had already voted before Election Day, and they had reported voting by Internet. The second observation that candidates make is increased turnout, and the third observation is youth engagement. They say that there's increased youth engagement. So is this the case? Is Internet voting having a dramatic impact on turnout, on youth engagement? I think that my assessment, my argument of this is that this likely has more to do with voting pattern changes as opposed to dramatically increased turnout. So for example, if these people are continual voters who vote all the time, and they're making use of it because of convenience, it could just mean that they're shifting their vote. So normally they would have voted on Election Day, but now they're voting in the advanced portion of the poll. So we're seeing, dramatic increases in advanced voter turnout, but we're maybe not seeing those same dramatic increases across the board in overall voter turnout. So the one clear observation from campaigns, I believe, is that these voting patterns are changing. And this is really important for communicating this to candidates because it makes the beginning part of the campaign so much more crucial. Historically, it's been the end of the campaign that candidates have mobilized and tried to garner their support, and they'll get the last sort of push out there. But when Internet voting seems to be in the game, the front portion of the election seems much more important. And then there were some negative items as well that were articulated. Candidates said that when they were going door to door, oftentimes they were having more discussions about Internet voting than about the actual campaign issues. And this is, of course, is problematic. Internet voting, I guess, is a controversial issue. But it's important that, voters or electors, rather, are as informed as possible about the candidates and their position on issues so they can ensure that they're electing someone who's a good representative for them. And then finally, a lot of candidates remarked on a negative impact on seniors. They said that seniors really struggled, not all seniors, but some seniors struggled and had a challenging time with the technology. So the Election Administrator Survey, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because I'm hoping the audience will benefit more from this. So again, with respect to satisfaction, we see a strong majority, 96% of administrators indicate that they're satisfied with internet voting. They describe it as being easy, accessible, convenient, cost-efficient, fast results, and accurate. Challenges that they communicated had to do, again, with seniors, issues with date of birth from the voter list, some delay in PINs, and confusion over the process. They want to see it in future elections. This is another indication of satisfaction. So 97% of the sample who completed the survey said that they would recommend it for their municipality for the 2018 elections. And it's also a service that they strongly support seeing in elections at higher levels of government as well in the future. So why internet voting? We wanted to know, what are the top reasons why jurisdictions, municipalities in Ontario are implementing internet voting? And this question was a ranked question. So they were asked to rank their top 3. So 25% of the responses ranked accessibility as being the top reason for adoption. 22% ranked improved turnout as their first choice, and 17% chose convenience. We also heard mention of cost reduction, being a leader in e-government. These were the main reasons. So compared to other jurisdictions and regions, particularly in Europe and Latin America, we see some differences. In Europe, the main rationales for adoption are leadership in e-government or innovation, as I mentioned earlier, and accessibility. And in Latin America, it's currently really about the mitigation of fraud, cost reduction, and innovating and incorporating that technology. So just really quickly, through the administrator's lens, we asked them to talk about what were the main benefits of internet voting in your opinion, and also the main challenges. So this slide shows the main benefits, and you can see that the 3 top benefits are convenience, accessibility, and counting efficiency. So these were, 2 of these, convenience and accessibility, were the main reasons for adoption. And then afterwards, they saw these as being the benefits, and they were satisfied with them. And then with respect to challenges, public outreach and education was the biggest challenge, and this has been communicated elsewhere also. We really see internet voting working well in the election process, working well for stakeholders when governments have really solid public education and outreach campaigns in place. Good relationships built with the media ahead of time, and it's interesting that the second challenge listed here is negative media. And then potential for fraud. So, there was concerns about a husband and wife, husband taking a wife's card or voting in front of one another. There were concerns about that. But the biggest concern is public outreach and education and how that can be sort of tackled. So perceived impacts. This is sort of interesting. Cost, everyone wants to know, when you introduce internet voting, is it going to break the bank? Can it save me money? Historically, there's been this opinion that internet voting is going to cost all kinds of money, and it's going to increase election budgets exponentially, and governments are just going to be put in the hole a lot. And this is not the case. So when we asked municipal respondents about costs, 38% said they didn't know. This likely has to do with the respondents. So typically we see, clerks, deputy clerks managing the election budget. We asked anyone who participated in the planning and execution of elections to complete the survey. So these persons maybe necessarily did not actually participate in the budget process. They were hired after the fact. So that likely could have to do with that, explain that number. So 31% say it decreased election costs, 18% said it increased them, 14% said it stayed the same. What can we take away from this? Well, we can take away that it depends. It really depends on the model that you're using, the voting options that you're offering, how long you're offering them for, the provider you go with, the size of your municipality, other contextual factors in your municipality, all sorts of things like that. So the conclusion is, as to whether internet voting breaks the bank or not, it can save money or it can be a splurge, it can raise election budgets, but it really, really depends on the design of the model. And I just wanted to add really quickly that we looked at whether there was a relationship between satisfaction and reported impact on cost. So we wanted to know, Are the people who are complaining about increases the people who aren't happy, and the people who are saying it's decreased the people who are really happy? And there was no connection. So we believe administrators are being honest about their assessments. Excuse me. So other perceived impacts. There is, again, a perceived impact on voter turnout. 58% said that there was a positive impact on voter turnout. 74% believe that there was more efficient tabulation of results. 93% thought that it made the electoral process much more accessible. So they were quite pleased with this. And then something really interesting is the perception of risk. So we asked administrators whether they perceived internet voting to be a riskier voting method than alternative ballot options. So we had three different questions, one comparing internet voting to voting by mail, to telephone, and to paper. And what's really interesting is that they communicated that they believe that internet voting poses the least risk of the remote voting options. So when compared to voting by mail or telephone, however, when compared to paper ballot voting, they weren't as quick to believe that. So there seems to be a perception that when it comes to remote voting, internet voting is the least risky, but paper ballot voting is still less risky than internet voting. So what are some commonalities among these stakeholder groups that we can take away from this? Well, one, we know that there's strong satisfaction with internet voting among all of these stakeholder groups. The greatest satisfaction in the 90th percentiles comes from voters in election administration. We know that all of these stakeholder groups support wanting to see it as an additional voting method in future elections. Voters in election admin in particular were asked about all elections, and there was, again, very strong support for seeing it in elections at higher levels of government, subnationally and nationally in Canada. Third, there is this perception of improved accessibility and convenience among all groups. And what's really great is that administrators are bringing this technology in because they want to improve accessibility and convenience, and so they believe they're seeing those results, which is good. Excuse me. And voters also communicate that that they are voting and casting a ballot for these reasons and seeing these results, so that's great as well. There's a perception of improved turnout. Now, certainly this is the case in some areas. It's not the case in all areas. Turnout is a very tricky thing, and it's very dependent on a range of contextual factors, institutional factors, cultural factors, all sorts of factors. So adding digital technology for casting ballots, particularly internet voting, is a small structural change to the election process. And it can certainly have an impact on turnout, but it's one part and parcel of a host of contextual factors that can affect voter participation. And then again, just as I mentioned, all of these groups believe that internet voting makes the voting process easier, and they also think that it adds efficiencies to the traditional election process. So what can we learn from this? What can you take away from these findings? There's two slides to speak to this, and I think some really interesting information. We know that, for one, internet voting is clearly desirable for election stakeholders in Ontario. It's a service change that internet voters, candidates, and election administration want to see municipally and at other levels of government. We can say for sure now, after about 10 years of research, it's not going to be a solution that's going to improve voter turnout and engage oodles of youth. The simple fact is that youth vote less than older electors. It's been a well-established fact in the voting behavior literature for years, and it's not going to be changed. We do see some potential to engage non-voters with internet voting, a modest proportion of the electorate. And what else is really interesting is that when we look at age and we say, why did you vote? And I mentioned that convenience is the average method for the rationale for voting for an internet voter. We see that the youngest electors, so those aged 18 to 24, and the oldest potential voters, those aged 65 and up, are much more likely to say that they voted by internet for reasons of accessibility than the other age groups. And they cite, for young people that they were away at school and it made it so much easier. And for older people, they say they had transportation issues, illness, or mobility issues. So for the youngest and oldest segments of the electorate, it seems that there is some potential there to bring them into the electoral process by improving accessibility. There also seem to be some challenges to older electors. So both candidates and electoral administrators communicated challenges. But at the same time, older electors are the biggest users. So what does this mean? Well, it means that technology isn't an issue for all older electors, and some people, have good digital literacy profiles and they're making use of it, and other people maybe don't, and they're still making use of it. But there is still a challenge for some seniors, and this can largely be managed with public education and outreach. Changing voting patterns. This is really important. So we're typically seeing the advanced portion of the election being done away with. So instead of having, 2 or 3 days or 5 days to vote and then a break and then election day, we're just seeing an overall voting period, a 2-week voting period, for example. And we're seeing a lot more people casting their ballot in the advanced portion of the election as opposed to on election day. This has very important impacts for campaigns, and it's important for electoral administrators to be aware of this. Internet voting does not have to break the bank. Cost really depends on model structure. We saw in 2012 a lot of Nova Scotia municipalities that implemented internet voting without having to increase their election budget from the previous election cycle. So it can be done. Challenges. So education and outreach, as I mentioned, appears to be a big challenge. Another challenge that wasn't necessarily articulated as much in the surveys, but that I've learned from working with municipalities, is the voters list. And this, came into play with date of birth and PINs, getting an accurate voters list, which I know is a challenge for any level of government, but this is something that we can all work on together. And then finally, accessibility and convenience. These are really the big draws for these groups. And they seem to be happy, and internet voting seems to be fulfilling these goals. Finally, the one thing I wanted to mention, and this is more broadly in the context of modernization, has to do with standards and verification. So I think a debate that needs to be had at some point in the next several years here in Canada is, should Canada follow suit in terms of creating some standards or regulations, and who should be responsible for that? Is that left up to the federal government, provincial government, local governments, whichever? And verification. Is this something that governments want to pursue? Are they content with letting the vendors go ahead and pursue this? That's up to them. But I think this is 2 important points that should be up for debate. And with that, I think I'll end the presentation. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Nicole. We do have some questions that have come in already, and feel free. We have about 13 minutes to have some questions for you. The first question that's come in will be, what's the next for the study of internet voting?
So that's a great question. I think the next step is to get some comparative data. So we have this data from Ontario municipalities, which is wonderful. It would be great to get some data collected from Nova Scotia municipalities and their forthcoming elections in 2016 in the future, and also some comparative data from international jurisdictions to compare patterns, because from what we know so far, Canada, Ontario specifically, is rather unique compared to European nations.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is, which we know the answer to the first part, but was the internet voting survey only offered to voters who voted online after casting their online ballot? And if so, how is this an accurate representation of the interest in online voting, as it does not reflect the people who do not want online voting?
Right. So the internet voting findings presented today, yes. So the people that were, prompted with a survey had cast their ballots online. This is good because it allows us to understand the perspectives and profiles of internet voters. Now, there was also, as I mentioned, surveys that were carried out at the polls with paper ballot voters, where we asked them about why they chose not to use internet voting and talked to them about their concerns. So we do have a small comparative sample to be able to draw upon for that. Just because of the resources in the project, we weren't able to, it's quite costly to facilitate these in-poll surveys, so we weren't able to do it for all of the municipalities that participated, but certainly that was an issue that we did address through the paper ballot survey. Great.
And just, for the purpose of the audience, part of the challenge of conducting this, since my Ask Canadian team did the data collection, is the cost and the process of conducting at the polls. And while Nicole had support from SSHRC to support this project, it was a challenge for many of the municipalities to be able to find the resources to be able to conduct the surveys, the paper surveys at the poll, and hopefully in the future, that we can get more support in that. The next question is related to the principle of the secret ballot. Has that been a topic in the political debate on iVoting? And this question is coming from Norway. So in Norway, it was the reason why the trial didn't continue.
So you mean other people being able to see that you've cast a ballot? Is that what they mean by this?
The question is, has the idea of a secret ballot been a topic in the political debate on internet voting?
Yeah. I mean, privacy in general is a really important issue. And typically what you hear is that people are concerned about internet voting because they're worried that it's going to impede privacy, because a husband and wife are going to be sitting at home together and vote in front of one another. And, that's not supposed to be happening. What I found was really interesting from the findings is that a lot of internet voters remarked that they were actually satisfied with internet voting because of the additional privacy it provided them with, which I was not expecting. So we saw a pretty good proportion of people, and this will be in the report, talk about privacy as being a big benefit of internet voting. But certainly, voting privately is a concern. A lot of municipalities have worked to mitigate this by, publicly advertising the fact that, it should be secret and you must cast your own ballot, and there could be a fine for this or jail time. But largely, people remarked that internet voting actually, they felt it was more private.
Next question is, without standards or regulations, how will this limit the take-up of internet voting across different levels of the Canadian government?
I think that's a great question. And I think that one of the things that needs to happen in the next few years is, a team of experts needs to be brought together. Experts meaning, some academics from different areas, so, political science, computer scientists, lawyers, government officials, looking at developing these regulations, because I think the future of electoral modernization in Canada generally, and especially internet voting, is going to be contingent upon these regulations. Now, Canada may choose to develop their own regulations, or they may choose to use the regulations of other areas. So the Council of Europe recommendations, which I briefly mentioned from 2004, are very outdated, and they're looking at revisiting these right now. So Canada may wish to participate in that if the federal government wants to take charge of that. They may choose to participate in that, or they may choose to go their own way. But it is very important.
Great. The next question, I'm trying to understand it. It's not really a question, but I think we have to give voice to those who are challenge the security of internet voting. And here's an interesting question or statement that comes in. So to preface it, Nicole, a lot of this is really sort of out of your realm, not being a computer scientist or a technology person, but someone who's observing it from a political science and user point of view or elector point of view. But I think it's worthwhile mentioning and having you have a chance to respond. So how do you propose to guarantee that voters are cast as counted when the voter's computer may have election rigging malware that changes the vote before it's sent over the internet and the voter will never know? I suggest that you look at the Zeus virus, which steals money from victims' online accounts without the victims knowing. It's even easier to change someone's vote.
Yeah, so definitely I think that verification is an important trend. I was at the eVote conference in Austria earlier this year, and people from all jurisdictions were talking about verification, and that certainly is the way that Switzerland is moving, Estonia and Australia with respect to internet voting. And it's important for Canada. I can't speak directly to that virus because I don't, my background, and I haven't studied it, but I do think that verification is important and that we should be looking at it as we move forward.
And I'll wade in, and I do find it quite humorous when sort of these, the people who are against the idea of providing technology as a voting option try to bring up other viruses, and these are very real concerns. But the reality is that, these are concerns that we're always going to feel. It could happen at at a polling station in terms of someone taking over and doing things that are inappropriate. But these are criminal acts. So these are issues that the technology companies that are promoting these technologies are trying to address and verify. But, you know, there are concerns to be addressed, but, you know, I am being, for somebody who's a firm believer in the use of digital technologies, what we're observing here is a demand for voters who are using internet voting that they like it. And I think, you know, that's the purpose of what this particular webinar is about. And perhaps in the future, we can actually give a platform to some academics who are looking at it from that security and technology point. Here's another question. Did any municipal administrators comment on the effort to implement an internet election? Was it easy or difficult?
Yeah, there was comments about that. You know, it really depended on the municipality. Some who had done it for the first time remarked that it was a lot easier than they thought it was going to be, and others remarked that it was a bit more challenging. What I'm hoping is really going to come from this research is somewhat of a roadmap for municipalities for implementation in the future and for best practices if they decide to reuse in the next election cycle so that they can benefit from this and learn about best practices and have smoother implementation.
Great. You mentioned that election administrators reported a perceived positive impact on voter turnout. Is there any evidence that e-voting boosted voter turnout in the municipalities that offered internet voting last October?
That is a great question. So I think a lot of it has to do with perception, and of course perception doesn't mean that it necessarily increased. I can tell you from the 97 municipalities that used internet voting, there was a turnout increase. This doesn't really speak to any correlation, but there was a turnout increase in 52, and there was a turnout decrease in 44, which does not add up to 97. But the one municipality that I'm leaving out was fully acclaimed in 2010, so we can't really compare a difference between 2010 and 2014. The fact is that turnout is so dependent on a range of contextual factors. So we can't really say just from looking at the surface if internet voting improved in one election or decreased in one election. Voter turnout improved in one or decreased in one, that's a consequence of internet voting. We really need to do some higher level statistical analysis and look at this over time. And we have been working on doing that. Doing a regression analysis of the 2010 Ontario elections, we saw that we took a sample of 44 municipalities that used internet voting, and then we took a matched sample of 44 municipalities that did not use it, and we matched them on a range of sociodemographic characteristics. And we found that there was a 3.5% increase overall in the municipalities that used internet voting. Very modest increase. Now our goal is to look at data over time. So we want to look at data from 2000, which is the pre-internet period before internet voting was introduced, all the way up till 2014. We tried doing this in 2010, but our sample wasn't big enough. So now that we have this data, that's going to be on the project roster this summer to try and figure out, over time in Ontario, what is the effect of internet voting on turnout more conclusively?
Good. I think we have time for one more question, and this is many IT specialists think that there is no technology for the moment that can provide a secure internet vote. For example, Professor Halderman, who reportedly hacked the iVoting systems of Washington, D.C. and Estonia. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you just repeat the front end of the question?
Many IT specialists think that there is no technology for the moment that could provide a secure internet voting environment.
Yeah, definitely. I think there seems to be, someone can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but I think there seems to be a divide among tech experts and computer scientists. There's some that believe that, secure internet voting cannot be done. It's not an option, not going to happen. And they don't even think that, online banking is secure. But there's another group who is actively working towards solutions, and I think that they believe that it is possible. So one of the things that I really would like to do in the next year or so is put together a project that brings together this range of experts, as I mentioned, and sort of helps to develop standards and looks at how we can safely continue to modernize elections in Canada.
Great comment, and I think the important thing to note for Nicole is that she's studying, collecting a great deal of data about the attitudes of voters. And, the question around whether IT specialists think there's, in terms of for secure internet voting, I think that's outside her realm, and I don't think that's another area for someone to study. And we hope, like I mentioned, that the center can translate and disseminate some of the knowledge that's being created in some of the universities around the security of elections, or the real risk of this happening in an applied environment. I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to encourage everybody to go to the Center for E-Democracy website. We will be releasing a video or an audio and or replay of this webinar, and we will be releasing the Center's translated version of Nicole's report in the next month or so. So thank you for participating, and please visit the Center for E-Democracy, and if you have a chance, donate and help us realize our vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you.